The crimson sun hung low over the horizon as Clara Shepherd staggered along the dusty trail leading to Buffalo, Wyoming territory. Her dress, once a cheerful blue calico, was now coated with the grime of weeks on the road, and her swollen belly strained against the worn fabric. She was 7 months along with twins, according to the midwife in the last town, though Clara had suspected as much from the way they kicked and tumbled inside her. Exhaustion weighed down her every step, but determination kept her moving forward. It was 1878, and the West was still wild and untamed. Clara had fled Missouri after her husband died in a mining accident, leaving her not only a widow but also with mounting debts. When she discovered her pregnancy shortly after the funeral, she knew she couldn't stay. Her husband's creditors had already started circling, threatening to take the small home they had shared. With nowhere else to go, she had packed what little she could carry and headed west, following rumors of work in the booming cattle towns. "Just a little further," she whispered to her unborn children, her hand cradling her belly protectively. "We'll find a place to rest soon." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain. Clara glanced anxiously at the darkening sky. A storm was brewing, and she had no shelter for the night. Her meager savings had run out 2 towns back, forcing her to sleep under the stars when she couldn't find work washing dishes or mending clothes in exchange for a place to sleep. The first heavy drops began to fall just as Buffalo came into view. The small frontier town was nestled against the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street. Relief flooded through Clara, but it was short-lived. By the time she reached the edge of town, the rain was coming down in sheets and her dress was soaked through. She stumbled toward the nearest building, a general store with a small overhang. Huddling beneath it, she tried to catch her breath and consider her options. The store was closed for the evening, and she could see lights glowing in the saloon across the street, but a pregnant woman alone would find no welcome there. "Madam, you all right there?" the voice startled her. Clara turned to find a tall man on horseback, sheltered beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a heavy duster. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but she could see concern in his eyes. "I'm just waiting out the rain," she said, her voice barely audible above the downpour. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse beneath the overhang. Up close, Clara could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw shadowed with stubble and eyes the color of a summer sky. "You look like you've been on the road a while," he observed, taking in her bedraggled appearance and the small bundle at her feet. Clara nodded, too exhausted to speak further. A strong kick from one of the babies made her wince and place a hand on her belly. The man's eyes widened as he noticed her condition. "You're expecting twins," Clara admitted, seeing no reason to hide it. "I'm trying to reach the livery stable. I heard the owner sometimes lets travelers sleep in the hayloft." Thunder crashed overhead, making her jump. The man frowned, his gaze assessing. "Name's Xander Atwood," he said, removing his hat. "I own a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. It's not much, but it's dry." He gestured to her belly. "You're carrying twins with no roof over your head. My roof will do, at least until this storm passes." Clara hesitated. She'd learned the hard way that kindness often came with expectations, especially from men. Xander seemed to read her thoughts. "Just offering shelter, madam, nothing more. Got a spare room my sister used when she visited last year. It's yours if you want it." Something in his straightforward manner reassured her, or perhaps it was simply that she had no better options. "Clara Shepherd," she said finally, extending her hand, "and I would be grateful for a dry place to sleep tonight." Xander nodded, taking her bundle and securing it to his saddle. Then, with gentle hands, he helped Clara onto his horse before mounting behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, creating a protective circle that made Clara feel safer than she had in months. "Hold tight, Mrs. Shepherd," he murmured, and then they were moving, the horses' hooves splashing through puddles as they made their way out of town. Clara leaned back slightly against Xander's solid chest, too tired to maintain her usual wariness. The rhythm of the horse's gait and the steady beat of rain lulled her into a half-doze. She barely noticed when they turned off the main road onto a narrower path, only coming fully awake when the horse slowed to a stop. Through the rain, she could make out the silhouette of a modest cabin, light spilling from its windows. A large barn stood nearby, and beyond that, fenced pastures stretched into the darkness. "Home sweet home," Xander said, dismounting and reaching up to help her down. Clara's legs nearly buckled as her feet touched the ground, and Xander's strong hands steadied her. "Easy now," he said, concern evident in his voice. He led her to the cabin, opening the door to reveal a tidy, if simple, interior. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the wooden furniture. A large table dominated one side of the main room, while a rocking chair and bookshelf created a cozy corner near the fire. "Let me get you something dry to wear," Xander said, disappearing into another room. He returned with a nightshirt and robe. "These were my sister's, they should fit over." He gestured vaguely at her belly. "Thank you," Clara said, taking the offered clothing. "Bedrooms through there," Xander said, pointing to a door. "I'll see to my horse and bring in your things." "Take your time." Once alone, Clara changed quickly, relieved to be out of her wet clothes. The nightshirt was large enough to accommodate her pregnant form, and the robe provided an additional layer of modesty. She found a comb on the dresser and did her best to untangle her dark hair, which hung in damp waves down her back. When she emerged, Xander was stoking the fire, his duster and hat hanging on pegs by the door. He had set a kettle to boil and was laying out bread, cheese, and dried meat on the table. "Hope you're hungry," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Clara's stomach rumbled in response, and a smile tugged at Xander's lips. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "Starving," Clara admitted, taking a seat. "I haven't eaten since this morning." Concern flashed in Xander's eyes. "That won't do, especially in your condition. Eat your fill, Mrs. Shepherd." "Clara, please," she said, helping herself to a thick slice of bread and cheese. "And thank you for your kindness." Xander poured hot water into a teapot and set it on the table to steep. "No need for thanks, couldn't leave you out in that storm." They ate in companionable silence, the rain drumming on the roof. Clara felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders as warmth and food revived her. When she had eaten her fill, Xander cleared the plates and brought her a cup of tea. "So, Clara," he said, settling across from her with his own cup, "what brings you to Buffalo? You've got family here." Clara sipped her tea before answering. No family at all, actually. I'm looking for work." Xander raised an eyebrow. "Work in your condition." "I don't have much choice," Clara replied, her hand moving protectively to her belly. "My husband died 4 months ago. I had to leave Missouri before his creditors took everything." Xander's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss," Clara nodded, looking down at her tea. "Thank you." "What kind of work were you hoping to find?" "Anything, really. I can cook, clean, so. I worked as a school teacher before I married, but..." She glanced down at her belly. "No school would hire me now." Xander was quiet for a moment, considering. Buffalo's a small town. "Not many opportunities, especially for a woman in your situation." Clara's heart sank. She had known it was a long shot, but hearing it confirmed made the reality of her predicament that much starker. "But," Xander continued, "I could use some help around here. My sister used to keep house for me, but she got married last year and moved to Cheyenne." He gestured around the cabin. "As you can see, I'm not much of a housekeeper." Clara looked around, noticing for the first time the fine layer of dust on the bookshelves and the stack of mending piled in a basket by the rocking chair. "You're offering me a job, room and board, plus a small wage," Xander said with a nod. "At least until the babies come. After that, well, we can figure something out." He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking uncertain. "Unless you had other plans," Clara stared at him, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." Xander shrugged, his eyes meeting hers. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be alone and in need of help." He stood, clearing his throat. "Think about it, you don't need to decide tonight." "Yes," Clara said quickly before she could second-guess herself. "Yes, I'd like to accept your offer." Relief flickered across Xander's face. "Good, that's settled then." He picked up their empty cups. "You should get some rest. We can talk more in the morning." Clara rose, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. "Thank you, Mr. Atwood." "Xander," he corrected with a small smile. If we're going to be living under the same roof, we might as well use first names. Xander, Clara repeated, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. Good night. Good night, Clara, he replied softly. Sleep well. As Clara settled into the comfortable bed, listening to the rain on the roof and the occasional creak of floorboards as Xander moved about the cabin, she felt a cautious hope stir within her. Perhaps here, in this small cabin with this quiet, kind man, she and her babies might find a safe haven after all. The following weeks fell into a pattern that surprised Clara with its ease. Each morning, she would rise early to prepare breakfast before Xander headed out to tend to the ranch. The days were filled with cleaning, cooking, and mending, tasks that kept her busy but weren't too strenuous for her advancing pregnancy. In the evenings, they would share dinner and conversation by the fire, gradually learning each other's stories. Xander, she discovered, had inherited the ranch from his parents, who had died in a cholera outbreak 5 years earlier. He had an older brother who had left for California during the gold rush and rarely wrote. The ranch wasn't large, just enough cattle to make a modest living, but Xander managed it with the help of a young cowhand named Thomas, who lived in the bunkhouse near the barn. For his part, Xander learned that Clara had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a bookbinder. She had married Joseph Shepherd at 19, following him to the mining towns of Missouri. They had been trying for a child for 3 years when Joseph died, never knowing he would finally be a father. He would have been a good father, Clara said one evening, her hands resting on her belly. He always wanted children, Xander nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's not fair, the hand you've been dealt. Life rarely is, Clara replied, but there was no bitterness in her tone. But I've been fortunate in other ways. She met his gaze. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night. Xander looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. No, Clara said softly, they wouldn't have. As her pregnancy progressed, Xander became increasingly attentive, ensuring she didn't overexert herself and making trips into town for supplies she needed. He even brought back fabric and a pattern for baby clothes after noticing her eyeing his mending basket with a speculative look. I thought you might want to make some things for the little ones, he said gruffly, placing the packages on the table. Clara's eyes filled with tears at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Thank you, she whispered, touching the soft flannel. Xander shifted uncomfortably. It's nothing. Just practical. But they both knew it was more than that. The ranch became more of a home with each passing day. Clara planted a small garden, filled the cabin with wildflowers, and added her own touches to the decor. Xander, for his part, built a cradle large enough for 2 babies and set it up in Clara's room. It's not fancy, he apologized, running a hand over the smooth wood, but it's sturdy. Clara traced the careful joinery and the gentle curve of the rockers. It's perfect, she said, and meant it. As her due date approached, Xander insisted on riding into town to fetch Mrs. Patterson, the local midwife. The older woman arrived with a no-nonsense attitude and a bag full of supplies, immediately taking charge of the situation. First babies often take their time, she informed them after examining Clara, but twins can be unpredictable. Best I stay close. Xander gave up his room to the midwife and moved to the barn, appearing at the cabin door each morning with an anxious expression that made Clara smile despite her discomfort. Still here, she would reassure him. Still waiting. But on a warm evening in late May, as the sun was setting over the mountains, Clara's labor finally began. Mrs. Patterson shooed Xander from the cabin with instructions to boil water and then stay out of the way. Men are useless at times like these, she declared, closing the door firmly in his face. For hours, Xander paced the yard, wincing at each cry that escaped through the cabin walls. Thomas found him there, white-knuckled and tight-jawed. Boss, you're wearing a trench in the dirt, the young cowhand observed. Come sit down before you fall down. Xander allowed himself to be led to a bench by the corral, but he couldn't stop his leg from jiggling with nervous energy. It's taking too long, he muttered. Thomas shrugged. My ma had 8 of us. Sometimes it takes a while. Just then, a different cry pierced the night, the unmistakable wail of a newborn. Xander shot to his feet, staring at the cabin door. Minutes later, a second cry joined the first. Would you listen to that? Thomas said, grinning. Sounds like you've got 2 healthy sets of lungs in there. It was nearly an hour before Mrs. Patterson appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. You can come in now, she called to Xander. Mother and babies are doing fine. Xander approached the cabin with an odd mixture of eagerness and trepidation. Inside, he found Clara propped up in bed, her face pale but radiant, a tiny bundle cradled in each arm. Come meet your neighbors, she said with a tired smile. Xander moved closer, peering down at the 2 small faces. One baby had a shock of dark hair like Clara's, while the other had wispy reddish-gold curls that reminded him of autumn leaves. A boy and a girl, Clara said softly. This is Joseph, after his father. She nodded to the dark-haired infant. And this is Emma. They're perfect, Xander whispered, afraid to touch them but unable to look away. Clara shifted slightly. Would you like to hold one? Before Xander could protest, Mrs. Patterson was placing Emma in his arms, adjusting his hold to support her head. The tiny weight of her settled against his chest, and something inside him shifted, a tectonic movement of the heart. Hello, little one, he murmured, a finger gently stroking her cheek. Emma's eyes, still unfocused, seemed to look up at him, and her tiny hand escaped her blanket to grasp his finger with surprising strength. Clara watched them, a curious warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the physical aftermath of childbirth. In that moment, seeing the gentle giant of a rancher completely undone by a 7-pound baby girl, Clara realized that somewhere along the way she had come to care deeply for Xander Atwood. The realization should have frightened her. She was a recent widow, a mother of newborn twins, entirely dependent on Xander's continued goodwill. Developing feelings for him was complicated at best, foolhardy at worst. Yet watching him with Emma, Clara couldn't bring herself to regret the tenderness growing in her heart. The following weeks were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and snatched moments of sleep. Mrs. Patterson stayed for 3 days before declaring that Clara was recovering well and the babies were thriving. You've got a natural touch with them, she told Xander as she packed her bag. Most men are afraid they'll break them. Xander, who had indeed been terrified of exactly that on the first day, merely nodded. He had quickly become adept at cradling a baby in one arm while going about his business with the other, and had even mastered the art of changing diapers without too much fuss. Clara's duties around the house necessarily decreased as she focused on caring for the twins, but Xander never complained. Instead, he took on more household tasks himself, often preparing simple meals or hanging laundry while Clara nursed the babies. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, the twins sleeping in their cradle nearby, Xander cleared his throat nervously. I've been thinking, he began, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains, about the future. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Was this the moment he would tell her it was time for her to move on? She had been half expecting it since the babies were born, aware that they had complicated the simple arrangement he'd initially offered. Oh, she managed, her voice carefully neutral. The cabin's getting a bit cramped, Xander continued. I was thinking of adding on. Another bedroom, maybe a proper parlor. Clara blinked, surprised. That sounds like a significant undertaking. Xander nodded, still not looking at her. Would be yes. But Thomas has a brother who's good with carpentry. Between the 3 of us, we could have it done before winter. He paused. If you plan to stay that long, that is. The question hung in the air between them. Clara studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. Do you want us to stay? She asked softly. Now Xander turned to her, his blue eyes serious. I do, very much. As your housekeeper. A flush crept up Xander's neck. No, well, yes, if that's what you want, but I was hoping. He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck in a gesture Clara had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. Clara, I know it hasn't been long since your husband passed and you might not be ready to think about such things, but I care for you and for Joseph and Emma. I'd like to provide for you all properly. Clara's breath caught. Are you proposing, Xander? Doing a poor job of it, apparently, he muttered, then squared his shoulders. Yes, I am. I'm asking if you'll marry me, Clara. Not right away if you're not ready. I'll wait, but I wanted you to know my intentions. Clara was silent for a long moment, her mind whirling. She cared deeply for Xander, perhaps even loved him, though she had scarcely allowed herself to acknowledge it. But marriage was an enormous step, especially with two newborns to consider. "You'd be taking on a lot," she said finally. "Two babies that aren't yours, they would be," Xander interrupted firmly. "If you'll have me, I'd consider Joseph and Emma as much mine as if they were born of my blood." The conviction in his voice brought tears to Clara's eyes. "You're a good man, Xander Atwood. Is that a yes?" Clara smiled through her tears. I need some time to think. This isn't just about me, it's about what's best for Joseph and Emma too." Xander nodded, disappointment visible in his eyes but understanding as well. "Take all the time you need, I'll be here." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the future unwritten but full of possibility. Clara's time to think stretched into weeks, not because she was uncertain of her feelings for Xander, but because she needed to be sure she wasn't simply accepting his proposal out of gratitude or necessity. Xander, true to his word, didn't press her for an answer. He continued to be a steadfast presence, helping with the twins, maintaining the ranch, and treating Clara with a gentle respect that only deepened her affection for him. The twins grew quickly, developing distinct personalities. Joseph was serious and observant, his dark eyes taking in everything around him. Emma was more vocal and demanding, quick to cry but equally quick to smile, especially at Xander, who could always coax a gurgle of delight from her. It was Emma who ultimately prompted Clara's decision. One evening, as Xander sat in the rocking chair by the fire, Emma cradled against his broad chest, Clara overheard him speaking softly to the baby. "Your mama's going to make me wait forever, isn't she, little one?" he murmured, his finger caught in Emma's tiny fist. "But that's all right. Some things are worth waiting for." The simple sincerity of his words, spoken when he thought no one was listening, settled the last of Clara's doubts. She stepped into the room, Joseph sleeping in her arms. "Not forever," she said quietly. Xander looked up, startled. "Clara, I didn't hear you come in." "I've made my decision," she continued, moving to stand before him. "If your offer still stands, I'd be honored to become your wife." Xander's face transformed, joy lighting his features. "You're sure?" Clara nodded. "I am. You've given us a home when we had none, and you've cared for Joseph and Emma as if they were your own. But more than that, I've come to care for you, Xander, deeply." Xander carefully placed Emma in the cradle and stood, taking Clara's free hand in his. "I love you, Clara," he said simply. "You and these little ones have brought life back to this ranch and to me." Clara's heart swelled at the declaration. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both momentous and entirely natural. Xander's smile was radiant as he leaned down to place a gentle kiss on her lips, mindful of the sleeping baby between them. It was a tender moment, full of promise and new beginnings. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Buffalo. Mrs. Patterson held the twins, who remained remarkably quiet throughout the proceedings, almost as if they understood the significance of the day. Thomas stood as witness, beaming proudly as if he had somehow engineered the whole affair. "Never seen the boss so happy," he commented at the small reception afterward, held at the town's only hotel. "You've worked a miracle, Mrs. Atwood." Clara, still getting used to her new name, smiled. "I think we've worked it together, Thomas." That night, returning to the ranch, now truly their home, Clara felt a sense of completion she hadn't thought possible after Joseph's death. As Xander carried her across the threshold, the twins already asleep in their cradle, she knew she had found not just shelter, but belonging. Their life together settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and extraordinary. Xander proved to be a devoted husband and father, his initial awkwardness with the babies giving way to confident care. By the time Joseph and Emma were crawling, he had expanded the cabin as promised, adding a nursery for the twins and a proper bedroom for himself and Clara. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Clara's garden expanded to include vegetables and herbs, reducing their dependence on supplies from town. She even began making cheese from the milk of the 2 cows Xander purchased, selling the surplus in Buffalo for extra income. As the twins' first birthday approached, Clara realized she was expecting again. She shared the news with Xander one evening after the children were asleep. "A baby," he repeated, his expression one of wonder. "Our baby," Clara nodded, watching his face carefully. "Are you happy about it?" In answer, Xander swept her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, setting her down gently. "I love Joseph and Emma as my own, you know that, but to have a child with you, Clara—" "I know," she said softly, understanding the complex emotions behind his joy. "It's different, but not more. Our family is just growing." Xander placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "Our family," he echoed, awe in his voice. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though running after two active toddlers while expecting proved challenging. Xander hired a young woman from town, Beatrice, to help with the housework and childcare 3 days a week, allowing Clara some rest. In early December, with snow falling gently outside, Clara gave birth to a son they named William, after Xander's father. Unlike the twins' dramatic arrival, William's birth was straightforward, with Xander pacing outside for just 4 hours before Mrs. Patterson called him in to meet his son. "He has your eyes," Clara said tiredly, smiling up at her husband as he cradled the newborn. "And your spirit, I'd wager," Xander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at him, already fighting to keep his eyes open and see everything." Joseph and Emma, now nearly 2, were fascinated by their new brother, peering into his cradle with solemn interest. "Baby," Emma declared, while Joseph contented himself with gentle pats on William's blanket. The winter passed in a cozy blur of family moments. Spring brought new calves to the ranch and renewed energy to the household. As William grew from newborn to infant, the twins developed into chatty, curious toddlers who followed Xander around the ranch, helping with chores and asking endless questions. "Papa, why cows moo?" Emma would ask, her small hand tucked in Xander's as they walked to the barn. "Because that's how they talk to each other," he would explain patiently. "Why they talk," Joseph would follow up, never one to be outdone by his sister. "Because everyone needs to say something sometimes," Xander would reply, glancing back at Clara with a smile that spoke volumes about his contentment. By the summer of 1881, the Atwood Ranch had become known throughout the county for its hospitality and the quality of its beef. Xander had expanded the herd, hired 2 more hands, and built a larger barn. Clara's garden provided fresh produce not only for their family but also for several neighbors, and her reputation as a skilled seamstress brought in additional income. On warm evenings, they would often sit on the porch after the children were asleep, Clara working on mending while Xander read aloud from one of the books they had ordered from back east. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked one such evening, leaning against Xander's shoulder. "When you found me that rainy night, did you ever think we'd end up here?" Xander considered the question, his arm tightening around her waist. "I hoped," he admitted finally. "Even then, something about you felt right, like you belonged here, but I couldn't have imagined how complete you would make this place, this life." Clara turned her face up to his, the love of the past 3 years shining in her eyes. "You gave us a roof when we needed it most," she said softly. "But you gave us so much more than that, Xander. You gave us a home, a family." Xander kissed her gently, still marveling at the twist of fate that had brought this woman and her children into his life. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against her lips, "bringing you home that night." Inside, the children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. Outside, the Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above the ranch, stars winking like promises in the velvet darkness. And on the porch, Clara and Xander Atwood held each other close, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and the love that had given them all a place to belong. In the years that followed, the Atwood family continued to grow and thrive. William was joined by a sister, Catherine, born in the spring of 1883, and later by another brother, James, who arrived in the winter of 1885. The ranch expanded accordingly, with Xander building additions to the cabin until it resembled a proper farmhouse, with plenty of room for their bustling family. Joseph and Emma, though not biologically Xander's, never felt any different from their younger siblings. Xander made sure of that, spending equal time with each child, teaching the boys to ride and rope, and never discouraging Emma when she wanted to learn as well. "My daughter's going to know how to handle herself," he would say proudly when neighbors raised eyebrows at the sight of Emma on horseback, her dark hair flying behind her. Clara watched her family with a heart full of gratitude. The frightened, desperate woman who had stumbled into Buffalo all those years ago seemed like someone from another life. Now, surrounded by the love of her husband and children, she had found a strength and purpose she hadn't known she possessed. The ranch became a gathering place for the community, hosting holiday celebrations and summer picnics. Clara, remembering her days as a schoolteacher, began teaching the children of nearby ranches along with her own when the nearest school proved too far for daily travel. The front room of the Atwood house was transformed into a classroom 3 days a week, filled with the sound of young voices reciting lessons and singing songs. Xander, watching his wife in her element, surrounded by eager young minds, would often pause in his work to listen. "You're a natural teacher," he told her one evening as they prepared for bed. "Those children are lucky to have you." Clara smiled, combing out her hair, now streaked with a few strands of silver. "I'm the lucky one," she replied, "to have found this life, this family." She set down her brush and turned to him. "Do you remember that first night when you found me huddled under that store awning?" Xander sat beside her on the edge of the bed, taking her hand in his. "How could I forget? You looked so lost, but there was a fire in your eyes even then, determination." "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "Alone, pregnant, with no money and nowhere to go when you offered your roof." She shook her head, still amazed by his generosity after all these years. "You saved us, Xander." "No," he said softly, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You saved me. This place was just a house before you came. You made it a home." On the twins' 18th birthday, the family gathered for a special dinner. Joseph, tall and serious like his namesake but with Xander's quiet strength, had just been accepted to study law in Cheyenne. Emma, vivacious and determined, was planning to attend a women's college back east, having convinced Xander that the world was changing and women needed education just as much as men. As they sat around the large table that Xander had built when the family outgrew the original, Clara looked at each beloved face. Joseph and Emma on the cusp of adulthood, William, 15 and already showing a talent for ranching, Catherine, 12 and bookish like her mother, and James, 10, with a mischievous streak that kept them all on their toes. And Xander, his hair now salted with gray but his eyes still as blue and kind as the day they met, watching her from the head of the table with love that had only deepened with time. "I'd like to make a toast," Clara said, raising her glass. "To family, to love, and to the roof that shelters us all." "To family," they echoed, glasses clinking, later as they stood on the porch watching the sunset, a tradition they had maintained through all the years and changes. Xander wrapped his arm around Clara's waist, pulling her close. "Happy?" he asked, a question he still posed regularly, as if checking that the dream they lived hadn't somehow faded. Clara leaned into his embrace, watching the golden light spill over the land they had nurtured together, the home they had built from nothing but hope and hard work and love. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered, and knew it for the simple truth it was. From that rainy night when a desperate young widow with twins on the way had found shelter under a kind cowboy's roof, to this moment, surrounded by the family they had created together, their journey had been one of love's most enduring promises fulfilled. That in the shelter of each other, we find our truest home.